a well-known journalist. May I now request Mr. Ganapathy, President, SICKI, and Chairman of the Trigen Group to formally welcome our guest today. Mr. Ganapathy, please.
Thanks so much, Doctor. And good evening to all, and welcome to the penultimate lecture of this third webinar series of SICKI during this period that began around 24th March and seems to be never ending. Even as we were on the air yesterday, we got the news that Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and a few other states had extended it to 31st July. We've been having these lectures to get opinions from various industry experts and vertical heads on how to stay relevant, how to go through this, how to write this out, and how to bounce back, and what the new normal could be, or as somebody said, how the new abnormal could well be. Now, I have the greatest privilege of welcoming all of you to this, and in particular to our guest of honor today, Sagarika Ghosh, a friend of the family, a person who's clearly amongst one of the more engaging conversationalists, a great journalist, a great columnist, a tremendous liberal, a great mother, an amazing wife to the man who delivers news without noise every night. And in fact, I was at a book launch in Bangalore about 2 years ago when she launched the bestseller biography of one of India's prime ministers, late Indira Gandhi. And I heard somebody, you can disagree with whatever she says, but you have to respect her right to say it. And I think that is why I thought we should have a view on what leadership could be. It requires a tremendous leader to be a tremendous leader, in my opinion, to give an opinion against the run of play. And also it requires great leadership skills to survive and succeed against run of play. And alongside on the panel, in fact, I earlier introduced you somebody called Prakash Gurumurthy. And to me, he has been the inspiration of the season. In fact, to us, many of us, he's been the man of the moment. The other day, he runs a company called Bond Commerce. And in fact, he was the inspiration for zeroing in on the title today. He runs a company called Bond Commerce, a company which is in the IT park in Chennai. Not everybody knows, not all know it, but Bond Commerce is arguably one of the world's largest digital branding company today. He built it all up from a scratch. It's one of the great stories of startups. The other day, I spoke to Prakash and asked him how he was doing. I routinely dropped in on a call with him, and Prakash said, "Oh, Ganpa, I'm 3 times as busy as ever." I said, "Why is it that we are counting sheep and you are busy?" And then he said that he sat down, restructured the entire business model of his, and expanded the offerings to his clients. Every shop that you see on Fifth Avenue is branded by him. Need I say more about the importance of Prakash? Today, he says his order book is flowing. He's got thrice as much as orders that he normally gets during in the first quarter of any fiscal. Now, to me, that was the story of inspiration to decide on the topic today. Leadership in these times. It has to be different. And if you think differently, you can still succeed. And I thought we must have a lady to speak about leadership, because women around the world have conquered and they have left a better tale than everybody else. And that is why I thought I must invite a very dear member of my family and a person who not a day passes my wife and I don't discuss. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Sagarika Ghosh, and the mic is yours, T.S. Sudhir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ganapathy. I must first compliment you for throwing light on Prakash. I didn't know this side of Prakash Gurumurthy and how he has been doing during the lockdown. What do I say about Sagarika? Actually, I started my journalism career way back in 1992 with the Sunday Economic Times, and our office was in the Times House on Bahadur Shah Zafar Marg, ITO, Delhi. We were on the same floor, and I think Sagarika at that time used to write for the Sunday Times. Yes. And I remember she was seen as someone, people used to say, and I was a trainee sub-editor at that time, Sagarika, she's one of the rising stars of the Times of India. And Sunday Times was seen as a notch higher than the regular Times of India. So, so that's how, that was my first introduction to Sagarika those days, right? And of course, Uma, who used to be in the Times of India on the desk.
Yes, I remember her very well. I remember Uma very well. In fact, you know, every time I used to see her on the desk, I used to think, my gosh, what an attractive, dynamic girl this is, and what is she doing here in the Times of India desk? I'm so happy that Uma is now such a star at NDTV.
Well, I completely agree and endorse those adjectives that you use for her. So after different stints in different print organizations, of course, Sagarika was the face of the CNN IBN channel for many years, and now she's of course with as a political commentator on the Times Group, and of course writes every day, especially her delightful edit page. What do you call them? The last piece that comes on the
thirds.
The third. Okay, I used to write middles in the Times of India way back in the 90s for the Indian Express with Jag Suraya and Hiranmay Kalrekar. I mean, that's like in the late 80s.
So I also write serious stuff though.
Yeah, of course you do. Of course, you are an award-winning journalist and author. And apart from her 2 novels, of course, the book on Indira Gandhi, and of course also the theoretical work Why I'm a Liberal. As Mr. Ganapathy said, Sagarika will speak today on the leadership role and what kind of leadership is required in these very testing times. But of course, since she's also a media person, as I discussed with her yesterday, would also want an insight on the churn that is happening within the media space. How does she see the print media coping with this crisis internationally and nationally and regional press, as well as also the television and digital, because she's familiar with different forms of media, having traversed them over the past 3 to 4 decades. Sagarika, over to you. Thank you very much for joining us here.
Thank you so much, TS, for that wonderfully generous introduction. Ganpa, you know, you are a member of our family, and when you invited me, there is absolutely no way that I could have said no, because you have been so warm, so generous to Rajdeep and me. I remember that wonderful launch of Indira that you organized in Chennai, which is a delightful event, and after that we had that lovely dinner. So you know, it's a real delight for me to be here, and many thanks for your warm and generous words for including me in this seminar, in this webinar. I thought I'd talk about leadership, you know, in the political as well as in the media world. I'll start with a few comments on the media world, because as TS said, you know, this is the world which I'm familiar with, and the churn that's happening, the upheaval that's happening in the media at the moment is something I'll talk about. And then also I could bring in aspects of leadership, the female aspects of leadership, and also the kind of leadership that these times demand from you know, from both media leaders as well as political leaders. So I'll start with a few comments on the media. I joined journalism 30 years ago, like Sudhir. I joined in 1991, and I've been privileged to see a range in the media. You know, when I joined, we used to make pages on bromides, and there used to be set. TS, remember, you know, those bromides that used to come out of the bromide machine, and they would be set by hand, and they would be sent to the press. And from there to the world of Media 360, where, you know, news is happening in real time, 24/7. It's live streaming. It's on Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, video, viral video. You know, those old days of the newspaper, which came to you 24 hours later, and you digested the news. All that is gone. But over the years, what I have realized, and what is a real learning for me, and my big mission and my motive in doing journalism is credible, fact-based, accurate information is vital for a democracy. Because you see, if you don't have credible, fact-based information, the citizen cannot hold governments to account. And we cannot safeguard our liberty and our freedom. You know, as Thomas Jefferson said, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. So you need the vigilance of the journalist to safeguard the free society, to safeguard the free economy, to safeguard the culture of innovation, to keep society free from fear. Because, fear cripples innovation, fear cripples thinking, fear narrows the mind, fear destroys free enterprise. If there's a culture of fear, then there is no innovation, there is no enterprise, there is no thinking. So the journalist stands as the sort of sentinel to keep society free and to keep society alive and to keep questioning alive and to keep dissent alive and to keep the power of questions alive and to hold governments to account by providing credible information. Now, the thing is, the trend nowadays is often to say that, oh, journalists are either on this side or on that side, you're biased towards this side or that side. Actually, for journalists like me and for TS, we will ask questions because we believe in holding every government to account, in every administration to account. The idea is you function as the fourth estate because you want to hold governments to account and because you're doing it for the citizen. You're doing it so the citizen is empowered to question and to hold the government to account. Now, that's why democracies, I believe, need journalists and they need the free press. But sadly, this is a time when we're seeing a severe crisis. And, your Mitra dialogue uses the word turning calamity into opportunity. And this is, in fact, a calamity for the media at the moment. At the moment, as you know, India is ranked 142nd in the Press Freedom Index out of 180 countries. China's 177th. I mean, North Korea is 180, but we are 142. That's not something to be proud of. But in the times of coronavirus, what has happened is the media has been plunged into a kind of crisis that has taken all of us by surprise. The business models of the media are shattered. The business model of print journalism, of the newspaper, is broken. The business model of TV journalism is creaking. And the business model of the digital media is unsure. So we don't know what's going to happen to these forms of media. Let's look at what's happening to print journalism. The newspaper was already creaking, was already, facing depletion of its resources, was facing a depletion in its business model. Now with coronavirus and the lockdown and the shut off in advertising, the newspaper literally, I would say, is dying. The newspaper is almost dead. I mean, you've heard the stories of the layoffs, the cuts, the editions shutting down. There was also that very unfortunate, rumor that went around that newspapers were carrying the virus, that they were carrying a virus load, that by touching the newspaper, you could get the infection, which is not true because newspapers cannot carry that viral load. But as a result of all of this, as a result of distribution losses, as a result of massive advertising losses, as a result of a complete drop in advertising revenues, the newspaper has ceased to be viable. That is the sad truth. The big players may survive. The very big players with the big editions will survive, but the smaller newspapers, smaller publications, the magazines, the small newspaper, the word is calamity and catastrophe. That's what's happening in the newspaper. Television media, similarly. I mean, again, there's a huge drop in advertising revenue. And, you have 396 licensed channels at the moment, all of which are competing for the same advertising pie. As a result of competing for the advertising pie, you have more and more sensationalist news. You have the race for TRPs. You have Mr. Nation Wants to Know doing his business at 9 p.m. every evening. Why is he doing it? Because he needs the TRPs, he needs the advertising. Now, so television, again, the big players may survive. The big players may manage to keep themselves afloat, but the smaller channels, the regional channels, will again, I think, face extinction. Digital media is a third alternative, but again, the revenue stream for digital is not clear at the moment. What is the revenue model for digital media? How is digital media going to get revenues to finance a newsroom, to finance news operations, to finance news gathering? All of this is open to question. So, these three areas of the media, therefore, print, TV, and digital, to my mind, are facing a very serious crisis, and the future is looking uncertain. Now, let me join this to the politics and to political leadership. Now, what happens when your revenues dry up, when your advertising revenues dry up, when your finances are rocky? You become uniquely dependent on the government, because the government then is the dispenser of largesse. The government then is the dispenser of advertising. The government then has power over you because the government can control its advertising. Now, once the government has so much power over the media or over journalism, then what happens to the free press? The free press is then uniquely endangered because of its dependence on the government. So, if you are dependent on government for advertising, if you're dependent on government for access, if you're dependent on government for events which you mount in order to gain the revenue stream, if you're dependent on government to create an environment for you, you end up then limiting the scope of press freedom. What is happening to leadership at the moment across the board in the world and India, I would say, is that we have the rise of what I call elected authoritarianism. That is, in the 1930s, the enemy of democracy was communism. In the 1940s, the enemy of democracy was fascism. Today, the enemy of democracy is democracy, because it is through the democratic process that you're having leaders come up who are being elected, who are elected by massive mandates, but who are turning their back on the democratic process, who are turning their back on the norms and processes of democracy. That is, the institutions of democracy, the parliamentary nature of the parliamentary structures of liberal democracy, the free press, the courts, the civil services. These are the institutions and norms of democracy that are vital to this working of liberal democracy. And these are being destroyed not by outside influences, but by Democrats, by people who are coming from within the democratic system. So it's all over the world, whether it's, a Donald Trump, whether it's a Putin in Russia, whether it's a Jair Bolsonaro, whether it's, whether it's Mr. Narendra Modi, whether it's some state chief ministers, a Mamata Banerjee or a Nitish Kumar or a Naveen Patnaik, these are all the strongman leaders who have a cult of personality, who tend to be neglectful of democratic processes and democratic values. Now, I've said that in Corona times, actually, in times of coronavirus, the leaders and the leadership that is succeeding are the consensual, reconciling bridge builders. If you look at the states that are actually doing well in the fight against coronavirus, look at Karnataka. Karnataka is a standout coronavirus fighter. And Mr. B.S. Yedurappa has actually evolved a system by which he has recognized his own limitations. He's got in experts, he's got in the doctors, he's got the whole healthcare system working. He's someone who's not imposing his view, but he's going about it in a reconciling, consensus building manner. And this is paying off because Karnataka is actually doing much better than Telangana, whereas, Mr. K. Chandrasekhar Rao is much more of a dictatorial strongman leader and who tends to rule by diktat. It's the same in Rajasthan. In fact, I had pointed to Rajasthan and Karnataka as the two representatives of how consensus building, reconciling leaders can actually create a good governance culture. You know, if you look at Ashok Gehlot in Rajasthan, again, he's a consensus building, reconciling kind of a leader who has won a wonderful battle, won a terrific battle against coronavirus in the state of Bhilwara, in the town of Bhilwara. You know, Bhilwara, as you know, saw this explosion of COVID, and Gehlot tackled it very well. In the same way, you have, you know, the sort of the reconciling impulses of Uddhav Thackeray. Now, Uddhav Thackeray again was, you know, is seen to be inexperienced, or he's seen to be, you know, guided by the bureaucracy, but he has brought in experts, he's brought in doctors. In fact, the city doctors in Mumbai have created the wonderful dome facility. I don't know if you've seen that. It's that COVID fighting dome, which is which has been created by city doctors. Now, so the reconciling, bridge building, consensus seeking, low profile, unassuming leader, I believe the kind of leader which is needed in the kind of health and emergency we face today. Whereas an autocratic, dictatorial kind of strongman leader tends to be confrontational and tends to not bring everyone on board. You know, Arvind Kejriwal in Delhi, for example, you know, went out on this war against private hospitals, and he said, you know, he filed an FIR against Gangaram Hospital. And, you know, Aam Aadmi Party, you know, people were saying that the private hospitals are making money and they shouldn't be doing this. Now, this confrontational attitude cost Delhi a lot, because in the beginning, the private hospitals were not on board, stakeholders were not on board, and it created a trust deficit. So, you know, confrontation and, you know, personality cults which win elections. These are all very effective politicians in the electoral sphere. But in this kind of emergency, in this kind of health emergency, I believe these leaders don't bring people on board. They're not consensus builders. And therefore, I believe they're less successful than the consensus building, reconciling leadership that is required in this kind of health emergency. So coming back again to the media now, you see, when you have dominant, authoritarian, strongmen leaders, you then tend to not have media freedom. I mean, you know, I mean, from my biography of Indira Gandhi, I know that she was a tremendously charismatic leader. She was a tremendously charismatic politician. She was a politician who you know, was able to immediately attract people and win votes, but she was no Democrat. She was, in fact, an authoritarian leader. And as you know, she imposed the emergency, journalists were jailed. Now, when you have that kind of leadership, you then cannot have a free media, you cannot have the free press, you cannot have the press work for an open, innovative society, which is what we all want. You know, we all want a free society, we want a free economy, we want an economy, at least, you know, those of us who are liberals want the state to recede, want the state to roll back some of its powers. But when you have strongman leaders, you have the creation of the super state, or what I call the big state, where you have government literally everywhere. You have government, and as you say, from hotels to hospitals, you have government everywhere, and you have the government breathing down the neck of the media. You have the government breathing down the neck of every sector of society. And this results in the destruction of media freedom. So what has happened is, at the moment, things are happening. On the one hand, you have coronavirus, which is causing the economic lockdown, and which is calamitous for the media. On the other hand, you have these strongmen, authoritarian leaders politically, who are making it difficult for journalists and for media to actually survive and to be free. Now, what's the way forward? What's the way out of all this? What is the solution to all this? I believe that there is a solution. I believe that this is a time when we can say, let 100 flowers bloom. Because what we're going to see is, I think, looking ahead to the media, is even if the big newspapers don't survive, or they don't survive as watchdogs, even if the big TV channels don't survive as watchdogs, even if the digital stream is not going to get us revenue, what we're going to get, and we're seeing this increasingly, is scores of citizen journalists, blogs, investigative posts, small groups of citizens who are going to come together for investigation purposes, small groups of citizens banding together for stories on livelihood issues, gender justice, LGBTQ, environmental issues. I think we're seeing a plethora of small groups emerging, creating citizen journalism, creating blog sites, creating websites, creating forums, which will be accessed by the big media. Let's assume big media collapses. Let's assume that the newspapers become handmaidens to the government, the big TV channels become simply on deputation to the government. I still think you're going to see these small groups of citizen journalists, investigation reporters who are going to be out there, because the technology is making that happen. The technology is making a lot possible. A lot of people can now come together, they can get some CSR funding, and they can set up a very serious group which can look at, for example, health issues, or look at gender justice issues, or look at environmental issues, or look at all kinds of issues. There's a wonderful website called India Spend. There's another wonderful website called Cobra Post, which is doing investigation. And these are all putting up their videos, they're putting up their findings on social media, they're putting it up on websites so you can access them. So I believe this is a time when we're going to see a complete shift, and we're going to see a whole lot of players enter the market, enter the media space, away from the big media brands. So you're going to see a lot of new players, a lot of new young people out there. My advice to young journalists, and I say this to every media school that I address, is that today, if you want to be a journalist, if you want to be a journalist in today's India, you have to be platform agnostic. You can't say I'm only a print journalist, or I'm only a TV journalist, or I'm only a digital journalist. You have to do everything. You have to write, you have to shoot, you have to audio, you have to Facebook, you have to tweet it, you have to live it, you've got to Instagram it, you've got to do the whole shebang. So I would say you've got to be completely platform agnostic, and work to different platforms and put out your message on different platforms as a new way of doing journalism. So new ways of working, new ways of doing journalism, I would say, is to be completely platform agnostic. The days of that I'm only a newspaper writer, like TS and I were in our day, we were only newspaper writers. Then we moved to TV and we were TV journalists. Then we may be putting up our stuff on social media, but today you can't do that. I remember when I went to cover the Kumbh Mela in 2001, which was a massive spectacle, and I went and covered it for Outlook magazine. I was just reporting it, and it was a great treat for me to write it and to spend time and do a detailed report. Today, if you go to cover the Kumbh Mela, you'll have to write it, Facebook it, shoot it, tweet it, Instagram it, photograph it, do the whole range of media to capture something like the Kumbh. Now, are we losing something, or are we gaining something? That's the jury's out on that. But I would say that is the way to go. I think the same thing will happen in politics. You are seeing now a lot of new young leaders who are emerging, who give me a lot of hope. You are seeing, there are so many young people who are getting into the political space, who are organizing themselves in groups, who are talking about their concerns, whether it's all kinds of people, whether it's a Kanhaiya Kumar or a Jignesh Mewani, or the range of young people at the Aam Aadmi Party. Some of the Aam Aadmi Party people, I think are very impressive. You have the Raghav Chaddas, you have the Atishis, You have people in the people in all cross parties who are very who are young and who are dynamic, who are trying to come out. So I think we're looking at a redefinition of media, redefinition at how journalism is going to be done. The single source newspaper, the single source TV, that the days of that are over as well. I think that, I will only take one newspaper and I will only read this one newspaper and that's it. Or I'm only going to switch on this one television channel and that's going to give me my news. Those days are also gone. I think today you have everything at your fingertips. You have the whole digital list. You can scroll through whatever you want to read. You can scroll through whatever you want to curate. You can curate your own news list. So I think the days of the single source newspaper, or the single source of news, that's gone. So I think these are all going to make up the new normal. So I think this citizen journalism, decentralization of the media space, a complete cottage industrialization of the media space is going to be the way the media evolves. Because, as I said, the business model of advertising driven media for the moment is broken. I just want to say one last thing about fake news, which I think is interesting to us. Fake news is another issue that a lot of us in media are dealing with, and that is particularly true at the moment, because we have a very hyper polarized political discourse, and in this kind of hyper partisan politics, you have a lot of maliciously created content and a lot of biased content that is out there. Now, I think, again, the only way to counter fake news are these hundreds of fact-checking websites that are out there. That, again, is a real option for a budding journalist. The fact-checking websites, the fake news fighting websites, the websites that are out there to counter fake news. These are all, again, very, very important ways in which the media environment can work at the moment. So I think these are the remarks that I have. It's depressing. I think what's happening to the media is very, very depressing. I think as someone who really believes in the newspaper, I'm just so disappointed to see what's happening, to see all the, to see the upheaval, to see the kind of losses that people are going through. But hopefully, as I said, something will come of it. And I think what coronavirus has done is that it's hastened the crisis. The crisis was already building, but now the coronavirus has come and completely knocked the bottom out of the business model. Sadly, I would say that newspapers and even television have not adequately invested in content. You don't have the kind of hype, super content like an Economist or the New York Times, where people will actually subscribe and pay for the news. That kind of excellent content is not there. So, you have very low cover prices of 1 rupee 50 paise or whatever, and you're dependent entirely on advertising. So because you haven't bothered to create the content, you can't then monetize the content, and you're dependent on the advertising. Now that model, as I say, has collapsed.
Right. Yeah, okay. Sagarika, thank you very much for this very comprehensive look at both the world of media, also talking about leadership. Lots of queries. I'll start with a query that if a young journalist, a journalist who's probably 1 or 2 years in the profession, were to be listening to this, you spoke about being platform agnostic, point taken. Technology, everyone has access to it now. But in terms of basic journalism, does that young journalist does he or she need to tweak the basic journalistic tool to be successful in a 2020, post-2020 world?
TS, that's an excellent question. I think, again, we need to remind ourselves of the basic values of journalism, which is what I started with, that the need to question, the need to hold governments to account, the need to tell truth to power. That's why we're there, right? That's why we're journalists. That's why we're in the fourth estate, because there has to be a section of society that questions powerful governments. If we don't do it, who will? So today, what is happening is a lot of journalism itself is being, in a way, being criminalized. People are saying, oh, prostitute and news trader and these kind of words. I mean, I totally reject these words. Why should these words be used for journalists? So,
Right.
in terms of the basic tools of journalism, you have to be brave. Bravery is the infrastructure of journalism, as I say, because you have to be out there asking the questions. Journalists were always the cockroach in the room. We're always the uncomfortable person in the room. I mean, in a room of beautiful people, the journalist is always the uncomfortable person asking the questions who people don't want really to be there. But the journalist is there. Now, what's happened over time, as I've said, is that the cockroach became a butterfly. So the journalists began to sort of flutter around the rich and the powerful and became caught up in that same culture of celebrity. But I think given the kind of challenges that the citizens face today, given the kind of challenges that governments the way the governments are becoming more and more kind of authoritarian and more sort of opaque, you need journalists. You have to. We have to have the free press. And so therefore the basic tools of journalism, the need to question, the need to tell truth to power, these are still fashionable. These are still important.
Sagarika, you spoke about the media being, and I suppose you're referring to the mainstream media as cockroaches. Now, many people who are part of the social media ecosystem would probably presume that they are the Baygon spray for these cockroaches. Does that put a lot of stress? Mike Muralidharan also has a similar question, whether mainstream media has been under stress because of the power that social media now wields.
Well, I think social media is very important. I think social media is an important way to keep the democratic chatter alive. It's an important way to call journalists to question. It's a very important way to question journalistic choices and to question mainstream media. But the problem with social media is that it's becoming a forum of sort of hate and abuse more than genuine constructive dialogue. I love social media. I love being on social media, but I love social media because then it gives me an opportunity to, to question, to answer questions, to answer constructive criticism on my work. But if social media is going to just tell you that, your X and your Y and call you names and, use the kind of vicious language that women journalists particularly on social media get a huge amount of abuse. If that is going to be what social media is all about, then it's of no use. Then it's not facilitating the democratic dialogue. It's not facilitating the chatter. So I think social media is important, but it needs to be constructive and it needs to call mainstream media to account. But mainstream media, I believe, is really in a crisis. Its basic crisis is a revenue crisis.
Absolutely. You spoke about the role of citizen journalists, but when you are looking for getting genuine, real news from the small towns, the Mufassil towns, from the hinterland, you obviously depend a lot on stringers.
Yeah.
And they have been even more badly hit than their counterparts in the urban centers because they don't get their 500,000 rupees, which they need essentially to cover a particular news story. So do you see news largely becoming more and more urban centric without getting the news from where it happens in rural, semi-rural, semi-urban India?
There are lots of initiatives now that are actually trying to build these stringer networks and create a kind of platform for stringers to come together and put out their videos. You see, now it's also YouTube is a big platform for them, so they can put up videos on YouTube and get publicity through that as well. So it's not just that the mainstream media has to hire the stringers and the stringers have to supply to the mainstream media. Today, the stringer can also upload his video on YouTube. He can upload his video on social media. The trouble is monetization. How is it all of this going to be monetized? What is the revenue stream? So this is why I come back to it. There is no, the revenue stream is sort of is drying up. It's very difficult to foresee the future. But I believe that, there are, I think media has to survive as CSR, it has to survive as corporate social responsibility. See, the corporates have to understand that, do they believe in a free society? Do they believe in a free economy? Do you believe in liberty? And do you believe in sponsoring the champions of liberty? Do you believe in supporting those who are keeping liberty alive, or those who are who are keeping the free society alive? If you are interested in keeping the free society alive, if you believe that journalism is a public service, if you believe that journalism is a nation building activity, if you believe that journalism is there to serve the citizen, to empower the citizen so the citizen can question the government, then I think corporate should support journalism. Jeff Bezos has bought the Washington Post. There are today corporates who are funding various progressive websites which are actually doing very well. So I think media has to survive as CSR, and in the interest of a free society, and in the interest of public service. But then we have to understand that, do we believe in public service? Do we believe that journalism is a public service? Do we believe that creating space for freedom is a public service? Once there's a sense of shared values that yes, journalism is a public service, it's worth funding. It's worth funding stories that question the media, question the government. It's worth funding outfits that question and dissent and ask questions. Then I think it should be funded by progressive-minded corporates.
Do you see in the post-COVID world, or as we grapple with COVID, the mainstream media losing a bit of its sheen and power and clout and authority, and as a result leading to the mushrooming of many hyper-local, I'm not talking about East-based websites or newspapers or TV channels or South-based, but I'm looking at even more hyper-local, which probably can be funded by, say, a very small corporate in that particular area.
Yes. I think that's
Ganapati has a question internationally asking whether, do you see the neighborhood newspapers collapsing in the US post-COVID? So slightly different scenario in the US from that in India.
The US is actually, the big newspapers are surviving in the US. For example, the New York Times the New York Times is very good content. You and I would subscribe to the New York Times because we want to read those stories. The New York Times has gone out and specifically created excellent content. So has The Economist. Today, however expensive The Economist is, I'm sure you guys would love to subscribe to The Economist. So if you create excellent content, then, people will pay for you. But if you don't create the content and you give away your product as free, now, for example, in India, we don't pay for media. You pay 1 rupee for a newspaper. You don't pay anything for a TV channel at all. And, as I always say, if you pay peanuts, you will get monkeys. So the thing is, if you want excellence, you do have to pay for excellent products, because if you're paying, you will demand the excellence. If you're paying, you will demand a certain standard. And I think the New York Times has done extremely well there. So has so has The Economist, so has The Guardian. These are all papers that have invested heavily in content, heavily in good writing, heavily in good investigative journalism, which people are interested to read, and therefore they will pay for them. But that's a model that the West has taken.
Sagarika, since you spoke about the international scene, there's a question coming in from Majid Aziz from Karachi. He's asked, do you see a time when moderate, liberal, non-racist journalists from SAARC countries would join hands without prejudice, blame throwing and anger jingoism, and bring about some sanity in the region?
I hope so. That's a dream, actually. Every time I've been to Pakistan, I've actually been really impressed by the Pakistani journalists. They're extremely brave, and they stand up to the kind of forces that we don't have to stand up to in India. We haven't had to stand up to in India. So the Pakistani journalists have a lot of, I have a lot of respect for my Pakistani journalist friends. They are extremely brave. They do their jobs. Many of them face a lot of danger to their lives. So I think, this is a time when we have to, I think what coronavirus has done has made us realize our priorities and our perspectives very clearly. You know, in a health emergency, you do realize that, listen, you've got to figure out what is important and what needs to be done. Do you really want to carry on with this sort of blind hatred, or, you know, these passions, and do you want to carry on hating each other, or do you want to realize that there is an enemy out there which could take your life, and you need to cooperate, you need to create structures that are cooperative, you need to create structures that are working together, that are reconciling. You know, in that sense, I think these three chief ministers who I pointed to, for example, a Gehlot or a Yedurappa or a Thackeray, they have shown that, you know, reconciliation, consensus building, reaching out, creating platforms, listening to people, all of this is what works in a crisis. And so I think in a crisis like coronavirus, yeah, I mean, I think a SARC kind of a cooperative movement, which, you know, unites liberal-minded, progressive people who are interested in freedom, who are interested in liberty, who are interested in a free society. You know, also, I would like to say that liberal is not party political. It's not this party is liberal and that party is political. And liberal is a sense of shared values. Everybody is liberal. It doesn't matter which party you're in. So I would say that, you know, across the board, if people who are interested in preserving a free and dynamic society can come together and join hands, then that's really the need of the hour, because, you know, we're facing a calamity. We're facing, you know, I really like that word that you used in your Mitra dialogue introduction. It is a calamity, and it is an economic calamity, it's a social calamity, it's a moral calamity. How do we deal with this? We can't deal with it through hatred.
Yeah, I started by asking you about young journalists, but most of those who are losing jobs in the media space are those who are in their 50s or in their late 40s, probably who have not kind of spent their years in journalism developing other skill sets. So you have this large mass of people beyond 45 who are suddenly out of a job. What kind of retraining or reskilling can they possibly do at this stage, and whether they will find the opportunities to still kind of manage to make a living by doing what they do best?
You know, I think what they can do, and I've been speaking to a couple of people who are in this position, is to go into fields of communication, because, you know, if you have been in journalism, you may have picked up communication skills, you may have picked up skills of talking, or of writing, or of scripting, or of creating scripts, creating stories, creating reports. If you have these kind of these kind of skills, then you could hire this out to, you know, to those who need communicators, who need communication professionals, who need communication lecturers, who need communication specialists. But if you're in the 45 to 55 age group and you have been fired, or you're out of a job, it is very difficult to retrain yourself to work in the journalism field. I would say there's a lot you can do, you know, in terms of getting yourself involved in much more in community participation. You know, there's a lot to be done in banding together and forming communities and forming groups of people who can perhaps work as a community for something. You know, work as a group for some kind of social need, and therefore raise funds through that. There's a crying social need and a you know, civil society needs. That's where you need to be. For example, you know, teaching, or reaching out to schools that need teachers, or reaching out to, you know, volunteer groups that need volunteers, or reaching out to self-help groups, or reaching out to artisan groups, or reaching out to producers groups that need help, or that need civil society volunteers. Now, the issue really is remuneration. But I think there you'll have to, as a community, maybe try to raise resources, and raise resources through community work, you know, socially useful, productive work. There used to be that subject in school called socially useful, productive work. But I think that is an important way in which people who find themselves at a loose end at, say, age 50, can get involved in the mainstream and seek to re-energize themselves, find new skills, raise resources, and perhaps also create an avenue for working in social,
Yes.
for social uplift.
Right. Last couple of questions, Sagarika. You spoke about enemy of democracy is enemy. Now, Habib Hussain has a related question. He asked, would you think that democratic authoritarianism is more dangerous than communist and fascist and more difficult to handle in the years ahead?
Democratic authoritarianism is very difficult to handle, because the thing is, these are leaders elected with massive mandates, and they have massive support from the people. So it's not as if, but of course, so did the fascists have a lot of support, and so communists have also had mass support. But this is through the power of the vote. Now the issue really is that if there's an emergency declared, like for example Mrs. Gandhi declared an emergency, then it was legally declared, freedoms were clamped down, and you could fight, you had something to fight against. Right now the enemy, or the elected authoritarian, is invisible. It's working in all kinds of different ways. You don't know in which way your freedoms and your liberties are slowly being eroded. So I would say that democratic authoritarianism, which is the governing, it's the credo of our times. The elected autocrats are the sort of
Okay.
leaders of our times. And there are many reasons why this is happening. One of the reasons is actually media, because media actually creates this fascination for the individual. The Dabang, the Bahubali, the superhero, the man, the Mr. Fix-It, who will come from riding on a white horse, he'll fix your problems. We have movies also, Dabang, Bahubali, Mahabali, the Batman, Superman. So the strong men who will fix everything without recourse to the norms and processes of democracy, which are slow, which are tedious, which are tortuous. These are all given the go by for this Mr. Fix-It who will come and fix everything. The former
Right.
RBI governor Y.V. Reddy, I don't know if you're familiar with the speech he gave. Y.V. Reddy has actually shown that coalition governments are excellent for growth, but the governments with massive mandates actually produce low growth. Y.V. Reddy has shown that, in the years, Narasimha Rao year, Vajpayee year, Narasimha Rao, the rate of growth reached 9.6%. Vajpayee rate of growth reached 8%. So he calls the Vajpayee UPA 1 era, for example, the Vajpayee from 1998 after Kargil to the end of UPA 1, which was 2009. That period he calls a kind of golden era, because the growth went through the roof. But every time there's been a massive mandate, Indira Gandhi, massive mandate in 1971. Within 4 years, she had the emergency.
Yes.
Rajiv Gandhi, massive mandate in 1984. By 5 years, you had Bofors. So these massive mandates that are given lead to this democratic authoritarianism, and actually they're bad for the economy. Whereas the coalition governments, which are give and take, and coalition, they look messy, they look weak, but they actually deliver growth.
Right. The last question comes from Mr. K. Chandrasekharan. He wants to know, some of the press people seem to be working only to criticize whatever the government does, even during critical times like these. You cannot say that all that the government does is wrong. It sends a wrong signal. Isn't there a better way to critique?
I completely agree. I think that it's, simply taking on the government for the sake of taking on the government is not what we're supposed to be doing. I mean, there are lots of good things that governments do. There are lots of bad things that governments do. For example, I think the kind of campaign that was mounted against Mr. Manmohan Singh was terribly unfair. So in a similar way, a campaign mounted against a government for ideological reasons or for partisan reasons, that is not the duty of the press. I think the press needs to, as I say, credible, fact-checked, accurate, verified information is the way we have to go. That is what we have to place before the public. When I started in journalism, And TS, you remember, we would write copy that would go to the head of our department, that would go to the copy editor, that would go to the desk. They would find hundreds of faults with it. People would come back to you to check this, check that, and by the end you'd say, oh God, just put it on the bloody page, yaar. But the thing is that there would be checks and counter checks. That's very important.
In the
So I
pre-Google
think,
days.
yeah, I think it's very important. Those checks, those filters, those verified information. So verified, accurate, credible information is what we need to put out. Not diatribes against the government just for, oh, I don't like this particular person, or I don't like that particular person. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. So, I think often that tends to happen, which does give the press a bad name.
Right. Thank you very much, Sagarika, for this very comprehensive look at the media landscape and also the leadership question and the kind of leadership we would need in these very trying times.
So much.
May I now request Kumar Pal Chopra, Executive Member of SICKI, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Before KP comes on, let me thank Sagarika for what I thought was a great cerebral conversation, which was bound to happen when two great journalists talk with each other. Thank you, TS, for making it a great evening. And Sagarika, as always, very fascinating and very, very exciting to listen to. Thanks so much for sparing time.
Thanks, Ganpa. Thanks a lot. It was a real pleasure.
In fact, one comment on your social media thing, the impact of that, full impact of that, I felt once when I was standing in a queue in a security line at the Delhi airport. Suddenly one guy comes and taps me from behind and then says, "Sir, I'm Bhojaraj, I'm your Facebook friend." I said, "Oh," I've never seen him from Adam. I said, "This is the new world that's going to be where people, it's a very interesting moment."
Yeah.
You
Lots of possibilities.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks a ton, Sagarika. Stay safe and stay free.
All of you. Thanks a lot.
Let's do your best to the man who's going to come now on TV. Say hi to him. Say hi to Rajdeep, of course.
Yeah.
KP, all yours.
Yes, it's indeed my great pleasure and honor to propose this vote of thanks. And I, on behalf of SICKI and Mitra, and on my own behalf, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to the name of every household, Ms. Sagarika Ghosh, journalist, author, and a columnist, for enlightening us and being very candid on this very important topic of leadership at these times. I should also mention a deep sense of appreciation to our very own household name, Mr. T.S. Sudhir, for wonderfully anchoring this entire webinar for us and getting the best out of the speakers for us.
Yes.
Further,
wonderful conversation.
Further, we are grateful to our sponsors, Messrs. OPG Power, Olympia Group, and IG3 for their timely support. I would also like to express our sincere thanks to Mr. President Ganapati and the entire Secretariat of SICKI, Dr. Raghavan and Aishwarya, in putting this together. And last but not the least, I thank all the participants who participated and had made this webinar more engaging and interactive. Just a reminder for all of us that we will meet at 7:30 tomorrow again for a webinar where we will be having Mr. Jayant Sinha, former Minister Civil Aviation. So see you all there. Thank you all. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks a lot. It was a real.
Bye, Sagarika.
Bye. See you
Bye,
there.
TS.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you.
Kanpa. Bye, TS.
Bye.
See you.